Societies can appear stable for years, right until suddenly they don't. A financial crisis seems to emerge overnight. Supply chains suddenly fail. Political systems freeze under pressure. Public trust collapses faster than institutions can respond. And people ask the same question every time: how did this happen so quickly? But major societal breakdowns rarely emerge from a single event. The visible crisis is often only the moment when hidden pressure finally becomes impossible for society to absorb. Economic pressure, institutional rigidity, declining trust, social fragmentation, political polarization, growing complexity. For years, these pressures can continue building underneath the surface, while daily life still largely appears normal. People continue working. Institutions continue functioning. Markets continue operating. Governments continue governing. And because most visible structures remain intact, societies often assume the system itself remains fundamentally stable. But societies do not always respond to pressure gradually. Sometimes pressure accumulates quietly for long periods of time until relatively small disruptions suddenly trigger disproportionately large reactions across society at the same time. This is one of the most important characteristics of complex societies. Change is often nonlinear. Small pressures can produce small reactions for years. Then suddenly, society reaches a point where it can no longer absorb additional stress effectively. This is known as a tipping point. A forest can remain dry for months before a single spark triggers a massive fire. A financial system can absorb growing debt and instability for years before confidence suddenly collapses. A society can tolerate declining trust and fragmentation for long periods before a relatively small event suddenly produces mass unrest, institutional crisis, or political destabilization. The visible event often appears sudden, but the underlying pressure usually built slowly over time. In previous episodes, we explored how societies become more fragile as institutions grow more rigid, trust weakens, fragmentation spreads, and coordination becomes more difficult. And as these pressures begin reinforcing each other simultaneously, societies often become less capable of responding effectively to new disruptions. At first, this deterioration may be difficult to recognize clearly. Most institutions still function. Most systems still operate. Most people continue their daily lives. But resilience underneath the surface can already be weakening. This is one of the paradoxes of late-stage societies. The appearance of stability can continue long after society's ability to absorb pressure has already started declining. Fragility often remains hidden while conditions stay relatively normal. But once pressure grows beyond what society can absorb, dysfunction can spread rapidly across multiple parts of society at the same time. And this is why tipping points often feel sudden to the people experiencing them. A relatively small disruption suddenly creates financial instability, institutional paralysis, supply shortages, political crises, mass protests, legitimacy breakdown, and coordination failure. And once again, people ask the same question. But societal dysfunction rarely appears out of nowhere. Usually, the visible disruption was only the trigger. The deeper vulnerabilities already existed underneath the surface. History repeatedly shows this pattern. In 1929, years of rising leverage, financial interdependence, and hidden fragility suddenly collapsed into a crisis that appeared far larger and faster than the triggering event itself. Political crises often emerge after long periods of declining legitimacy and institutional rigidity. Periods of unrest often emerge after trust, cohesion, and coordination have already weakened across society. The triggering event may appear small compared to the reaction it produces, because the society itself had already become unstable underneath. This also explains why societies often struggle to respond effectively once dysfunction begins spreading. Institutions designed for normal conditions may no longer adapt quickly enough under accelerating pressure. Fragmented societies struggle to coordinate shared responses. Political systems become polarized precisely when cooperation becomes most necessary. And systems that once stabilized society can themselves become sources of rigidity, delay, and coordination failure. During tipping points, societies often experience a sudden loss of orientation. Familiar structures no longer behave predictably, and people begin realizing the systems they depended on are no longer functioning normally. At first, governments and institutions often attempt to stabilize dysfunction through additional intervention, more oversight, more emergency measures, more coordination mechanisms, more attempts to restore stability. And sometimes these interventions succeed temporarily. But in highly stressed societies, interventions can also create unintended consequences that produce new pressures elsewhere. Because interconnected societies rarely react in isolation. This is one of the defining characteristics of systemic dysfunction. Problems stop remaining contained. Economic pressure affects politics. Political instability affects institutions. Institutional weakness affects social trust. Social fragmentation affects coordination. Coordination failures increase economic instability. And once these pressures begin reinforcing each other simultaneously, dysfunction can spread faster than institutions can adapt. This does not necessarily mean collapse is inevitable. Many societies stabilize before reaching full systemic breakdown. Some adapt successfully. Some decentralize pressure. Some reform institutions before dysfunction becomes irreversible. But the farther societies move into fragmentation, rigidity, distrust, and coordination failures simultaneously, the more difficult stabilization becomes. Once you see this pattern, you begin recognizing it in specific signals. The first is cascading instability, when problems in one part of society increasingly trigger instability across multiple other areas at the same time. The second is declining resilience, when institutions and systems that once absorbed disruption begin reacting more severely to smaller shocks. The third is coordination breakdown, when governments, institutions, and social groups become increasingly unable to respond coherently under pressure. These are not necessarily signs that collapse is imminent. They are signs that societal stress may be approaching levels the existing structure is struggling to absorb. Systemic dysfunction does not emerge from a single cause. It emerges when multiple forms of pressure begin converging across society at the same time. And because complex societies depend on coordination across so many interconnected structures simultaneously, dysfunction in one area can increasingly spread throughout the larger system simultaneously. So, what happens when civilizations can no longer solve the pressures created by their own complexity? What happens when the systems that once expanded power and stability begin reaching their own structural limits? That's what we'll explore in the next episode. Tipping points and systemic dysfunction are part of TNBC Explainers, Module 4, Systems, Complexity, and Decline. This is TNBC Explainers, understanding how the world actually works. Explore the TNBC Explainers course via the YouTube course list, or visit thenextbigcycle.world for the full course overview and background. This is The Next Big Cycle, TNBC Explainers, your guide to understanding the systems shaping the world around you. TNBC Explainers is a growing YouTube course. New concepts are added over time.